Hello and welcome back to this series looking at anarchist writings and the history of anarchism. We're working off of Robert Graham's anthology Anarchism, a documentary history of libertarian ideas. So if you don't know, this anthology is in 3 volumes. The first volume was published in 2005. And covers really the history up to 1939. The second volume goes up through the 70s, and the third volume looks at contemporary writing. So we're just going to kind of, at a snail's pace, work our way through these writings, and I'll put up videos periodically. Hopefully at a slightly faster pace than I have been. I've been just doing other things, so haven't done too many of these. But anyways, let's jump right into this. This episode will be looking at Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's What is Property, which was originally published in 1840. So this, of course, is one of the founding texts in the anarchist tradition. It includes the famous phrase, property is theft, and it's also, it has his clear use of the term anarchism, or anarchist, as a political identification. So Proudhon often gets called the first anarchist because he's the first to call himself that. But as you know, we have other figures who clearly are in the anarchist tradition, but wrote earlier. So Proudhon is sometimes grouped with Fourier as one of the early socialist thinkers. And you can look at my episode about Fourier's thoughts about work and play. But Proudhon does not fit into the utopian designation very easily. Really, most importantly, he does not embrace intentional community the way Robert Owen or Fourier did. He escapes this path by talking about general social foundations of wealth and governance. So like Marx, he sees the problem and solution as systemic and not easily solved just by forming new communities. So while he does get grouped with Fourier, I think it's important to make a distinction between those who embrace intentional community and kind of separatism and forming model societies, and people like Proudhon and, you know, Marx for that matter, who see really the necessity to look at society as a whole. So in this video, I want to talk about his views on the origin of wealth and his position on the necessity or his position on governance. I shouldn't say the necessity of, but just what's his view of governance in the future, because that's his 2 most famous contributions. The Property is Theft deals with the origin of wealth, and I Am an Anarchist deals with his views on government. And we want to see how these are connected, if at all. And particularly we want to see the role of collective labor in the creation of wealth. So we all know Proudhon's claim that property is theft, but what is actually being stolen and how? So before moving on, we have to establish that property in this context refers to private ownership of the means of production in settings where labor collectively produces wealth. This is distinctive from possessions, which is just things like your house or your toothbrush. In fact, there is in reality no situation where labor is not collective. So even your independent artisan cobbler, who has his own tools, will rely on other entities and other workers to produce wealth, such as the leather tanners, the tool makers, the metalsmith, etc. Proudhon argues that the theft comes primarily from capitalists paying workers for their individual labor, but not for the collectivity of their labor. Quote, "It must be said that each capitalist has paid as many times one day's wage as he has employed laborers each day, for he has paid nothing for that immense power which results from the union and harmony of laborers." End quote. In short, 100 workers can build a house in significantly fewer total man hours than someone who does all the work by herself, if that was even possible. For instance, even with infinite time, no single worker could raise the pyramids, but a collectivity of workers obviously did achieve that. And it is not merely a question of brute labor power. Capital, knowledge, and organization are all parts of the production that are impossible without collectivity. Those who may want to imagine an ideal world of independent producers will never find it. Even our Paleolithic hunters and gatherers had to work together to survive or perform some of the most basic tasks. So Proudhon adds that collective labor is the great equalizer. it is not simply possible to determine which worker in a collective process did the most to create wealth. Labor markets may pay a skilled worker twice as much as this unskilled worker, but this is not because the market determines they contribute twice as much. It is because the market determines that they can pay them so much, or they need to pay the skilled worker twice as much. Obviously, if they can de-skill, this is why scientific management is so important, is if you can de-skill the skilled worker, you can pay him just as much as the unskilled worker. So it's about the labor market more than the actual value they contribute to it. So labor, quote unquote labor, undifferentiated in general, creates all wealth. So here we have the basic Smithian or Marxian or Ricardian idea of the labor theory of value, and Proudhon holds to it. But what are the conclusions he draws from it? And he points out three, essentially. One is that there is an inherent conflict between labor and the idle proprietor over acquisition of created wealth. Basically, he thinks the idle proprietor is simply stealing from labor, but in a sense, there's a conflict over who will control the wealth. Second, all production is collective and all laborers deserve what they contribute. So this second statement, this second kind of part of it is a little bit problematic. However, because it is difficult to determine who contributes the most. He does repeat several times in this essay that it's basically impossible to determine individual contribution to a collective labor process. So how do you say that laborers can deserve what they contribute? How do you determine what they contribute? I think ultimately we come to the conclusion that because it's almost impossible to determine that, basically communism is, at least to each according to his needs, is the only fair way and reasonable way to do this. So take an example of this. Take the worker repairing a storefront and the worker watching below him, below the ladder, watching the ladder beneath him, I mean. One may be on the surface working harder and maybe even seemingly contributing more, but the task is not possible without both. Each task is equally essential, and I'm sure the worker sweating on the top of the ladder doing his work is actually quite thankful that the worker down there watching the ladder is there at all, and would not begrudge him an equality of effort and sacrifice, or at least compensation due equal effort and sacrifice. Anyways, that's just I think Proudhon gets to essentially to each according to his needs here, even though he's saying laborers deserve what they contribute. So the third point would be no one can be the exclusive proprietor of accumulated capital, right? So this is the whole history of knowledge, the history of accumulated wealth, and no one can own it because it's produced by collective labor. Often, Marx is dead labor, I suppose. Literally dead in some cases. The workers who created it literally, in many cases, would be dead. That's certainly the case with knowledge. So let's move on to knowledge. One response to this kind of idea that all workers contribute in some kind of undifferentiatable mass, so you can't really say worker A deserves more than worker B, or manager A deserves more than, worker B, for that matter. The response I often heard to this is that people who accumulate wealth earn it through their knowledge. So Proudhon actually responds to this by reminding us that, quote, man's talents and knowledge, end quote, are products of universal intelligence and of general knowledge slowly accumulated by a knowledge of masters. Those are actually two brief quotes from him. So there's really nothing anyone knows that is not likewise a product of collective labor. One may pay for an education, but they are just buying a product. The knowledge itself acquired is still from collective labor, right? Like you may go to school to learn how to grow or how to genetically modify tomatoes through crossbreeding or whatever, but the knowledge of that is owned by humanity. It's essentially public domain. So I think this is basically true. Proudhon makes another interesting argument that seems to foreshadow Marxist ideas on demand crises. So to review the demand crisis argument and its relationship to the cycles of capitalism, if workers are paid less than what they produce, overproduction is inevitable eventually. Labor in an hour can produce many more cars than they could ever hope to buy. Proudhon sees this as a moral argument, though, even though he prefigures Marx's theory of the inherent contradictions in capitalist production. Proudhon wrote, quote, "As soon as demands begin to be felt, the factories fill up and everyone goes to work. Then business is lively, and both governors and governed rejoice. But the more they work today, the more idle they'll be hereafter. The more they laugh, the more they shall weep. Under the rules of property, the flowers of industry are woven into none but funeral wreaths. The laborer digs his own grave. If the factory stops running, the manufacturer has to pay interest on his capital the same as before. He naturally tries then to continue production by lessening expenses. Then comes the lowering of wages, the introduction of machinery, the employment of women and children to do the work of men, bad workmen and wretched work. They still produce, but the decreased cost creates a larger market. But they do not produce long because of cheapness being due to their quality and rapidity of production. The productive power tends more than ever to outstrip consumption." End quote. So you have various elements there, demand crisis, you got a little hint of declining rate of profit. So I think it's important to just see how much Proudhon here really does prefigure a lot of ideas we see essential in Capital. So yes, while not laying out the detail that Marx does in Capital, Proudhon does point to overproduction being the cause of the business cycle under capitalism, and gets to many of the same conclusions. He even ends this section with a vivid description of the overall misery of unemployment resulting from economic depression, one of the best passages in this article, I think. So in this article, as edited by Graham, Proudhon next jumps to talking about government. His declaration of being an anarchist should be connected to his theory of property, I think. He starts, again famously, by rejecting every other form of government, or aristocracy, monarchy, democracy, whatever, then in a conversation, and then declares that he is an anarchist. Now, why do we have government at all? In this series, we have seen this question tackled by early anarchist thinkers already, and it's a major part of Enlightenment era political thought. Like Thomas Paine, Proudhon sees it as a consequence of people having wants that need to be met. The more ignorant will be more likely to follow the leader, but our tendency to desire rules will lead us to question and perhaps even resist government once formed. So this becomes a check on government. So essentially, once government exists, we begin to inquire it, we begin to investigate it and think about it, and this leads us to ask questions of it, and then to question its justification, and eventually this leads to resistance. But once a king is forced to explain, due to some questioning, why his rule is just or necessary, the subject is now following reason, not government. So if the king's reason for being a king is justifiable and accepted by the subject is following the reasonable argument, not government itself as some kind of Leviathan, I guess. Now, this is a subtle but important difference because it lays the foundation of all critical political thinking. The inevitable consequence of this inquiry into government leads to, quote, seeking justice in equality and, quote, order and anarchy, two of Proudhon's phrases. He actually says here that we have been moving towards anarchy from the very origin of states, every time we questioned or interrogated the very reason and justification for government. Now, what does any of this have to do with property? Well, rule of the capitalist class over production and the rule of kings over society are similarly whittled away by reason. So, what are we moving towards in both realms? For Proudhon, it is, quote, scientific government. Again, that's his particular phrase, scientific government, which in its economic realm would be, kind of his productive vision of collective labor, where the benefits of that labor go to the workers. And scientific government is essentially anarchism for him, right? Government by reason. He then, and this is where Graham's selection ends, provides 10 maxims, which he thinks really cannot be easily refuted. And so I leave it to you to try to refute or not. The first, the distinction between property and possession exists. Not only are they distinct, but they are contradictory. Property destroys possessions in the same way that autocracy is the direct contradiction of democracy. Second, property cannot exist if people have a right to possessions. That is, if labor controls production, there is no space or role for property. In the same way, if society controls government, There is no power for rulers. 3. Collective labor creates general prosperity and removes distinctions. Quote, property is lost in common prosperity, end quote. So he sort of has a bit of a post-scarcity argument here. 4. Labor being collective also destroys property. This is slightly different from point 3. Point 3 is more about who gains from labor, and this point is more direct. The very nature of collective labor makes property meaningless. In a sense, it can only exist by power and violence, and the property is theft argument is apparent there. 5, since all of our wealth is based on accumulated wealth, capital, and accumulated knowledge, and all labor is collective, class distinctions are unjust and, in a sense, should not exist. No one can justify having a larger claim to these things than anyone else. 6, liberty is the foundation for fair commerce. This we may take for granted. Commerce that is forced or prices don't reflect the value of products will destroy commerce. There won't be an incentive to do it. But Proudhon also says that the true value of goods is based on labor, and therefore wages, like rights and duties, should be equal. And he's going to say more in a little bit about how can profit even exist in commerce. And in point 7, he argues, no, profit is impossible in a just exchange because equal value can only be exchanged for equal value without exploitation of some sort. Yes, I can trick someone into buying something for less value than it's worth, or paying for it with less value than it's worth, but that will just be exploitation of someone, some worker, some labor. Now, without exploitation of this sort, there's no space for social ills, luxury, or pauperism. Again, he thinks without property, there would be generally, we get to this, the eradication of social ills because all labor would be justly compensated for its contribution to the collective productive capacity of society. 8, if production is controlled by cooperative labor, participation will be voluntary and based on friendship and equality. 9, liberty is the true basis of society. Law and association as well, because it is based on, quote, equality in the means of production and equivalence in exchange. And then point 10, order with anarchy is society's highest perfection of the science of liberty and the only true end of political life. So those are these 10 maxims. They all sort of connect, but we see the clear connection he makes in these 10 points from his theory of property to his theory of order with anarchy as the perfection of liberty and the perfection of political life. So we have the two most well-known claims of Proudhon, and we notice that they're impossible to dislodge from one another. So I agree with Proudhon about the basic logic of his principles, but I do have a question, and I think he answers it. Now, as John Kenneth Galbraith argued in his works, written after World War II mostly, or as we see more recently in the book, The People's Republic of Walmart, planning is not only central to our modern economies, both in capitalism and in state socialism, it is probably essential. Proudhon could not have envisioned the size of firms that may almost be necessary. He was, of course, French, and looking at a French economy that was not yet fully industrialized and didn't have anything like the firms you would see in Japan or the United States by the end of the 19th century. So we are reminded of Jack London's The Iron Heel, where the major character Ernst Everhart has a socialist meeting and the grocers arrive at the meeting, and the grocers say, we're on board with your socialist revolution because we need to fight the conglomerates, the big, basically in the book's version of Walmart or Amazon or Whole Foods, whatever. And Ernst Everhart says, no, you're wrong. We're not fighting this revolution to restore the small producers. We are going to take progress and seize it for ourselves. So the big, massive firms are actually a step forward in providing people's basic needs. The problem is it's private. So it's not, the problem isn't that it exists so much as that it exists for the benefit of the one, of the owners. In the same way, we can imagine Amazon is not the problem in itself. Its problem is that it's a private corporation that mistreats its workers and is horrible in all those ways. But the idea of people purchasing stuff, having it arrive in their home a few days later, it actually makes a lot of sense if you're going to have a socialist or planned economy. Now, obviously, anarchists are skeptical of planned economies in various ways, but obviously it would have to be intensely planned if you're going to have direct democracy at the local level and networks of federated workplaces and neighborhoods and villages. It would have to be intensely planned, and the question is who does the planning, obviously. So, and I wouldn't say Proudhon has a clear idea about how collective labor would be planned in such a way to reflect his values. My thinking is that his anarchy is order view of political life is the solution. In this sense, I think he may agree that planning is essential. How could you not have some sort of planning if labor is collective? It is certainly not spontaneously functioning. You don't build a house spontaneously. It's, even a barn raising in some Amish village may happen quickly, but it's not spontaneous. It's incredibly planned. So he should also remember that planners are not original thinkers. While there may be breakthroughs once in a while, the basics of division of labor, logistics, or whatever have existed for hundreds of years, if not longer. Even ancient societies were likely planned to a degree. We see innovations in just-in-time delivery, post-Fordism, or whatnot, but these are rare. I think we basically are still in the realm of scientific management, more or less. So that does it for this kind of introduction to Proudhon. But as we'll see in the next video, Proudhon has his reservations about technology and the machine, and we'll need to grapple with that before we can really settle this question entirely. Planning and the machine seem to go hand in hand, at least they do in our world, if not Proudhon's. So that will be the next video. We'll be looking at another essay in this anthology dealing with machinery. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.